Hi, folks. Welcome to Eastern State Penitentiary's Sing Unburied series. My name is Janaye. I'm a tour guide at Eastern State, and I'm excited to share this program with you. To open this conversation, take a moment to consider this question. How do we learn about prison stories and people's experiences while in prison? At Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site, the job of a tour guide is to illuminate some of the stories of over 80,000 men, women, and children incarcerated here during its 142-year history, and the stories of the thousands of men and women who worked and lived there alongside them. Much of my work involves interpreting stories through old historic records and documents, as well as current reports and stats. However, in this video, I want to consider the following questions. What unique power can literature have in telling human stories? And how can fiction enhance our understanding of prison history and illuminate prison narratives and experiences? Over a series of 3 videos, I, along with my colleagues, Tom and Christine, will engage with these questions through a discussion of Jesmyn Ward's 2017 novel, Sing Unburied Sing, uncovering the ways in which Ward's portrait of incarceration, familial trauma, and drug addiction within a Mississippi family intersects with Eastern State's own history. You do not have to have read Jesmyn's book or been to Eastern State Penitentiary to engage with and think critically about the text and major themes. This series is intended to provide in-depth explorations of the roles race, incarcerated children, and labor play in both the novel and prison practices at Eastern State. To focus our discussion, we will be presenting direct quotes from various texts throughout the video. These quotes will be read by my colleague Dave for clarity. Please note that the language in these quotes are the author's and not our own. But to start, a brief synopsis of the novel. It's set in modern-day rural Mississippi and follows the complex lives of one impoverished mixed-race family. It circles around Jojo, a young 13-year-old boy, his toddler sister Kayla, Leonie, Jojo and Kayla's mother, who suffers from a drug addiction, Pop, Jojo's grandmother, and Ma'am, Jojo's grandmother, who is dying from cancer. Michael is Jojo and Kayla's white father, who was recently incarcerated at Parchman Farm, the Mississippi State Penitentiary. Jojo and Kayla live with their grandparents, while Leonie, their mother, kind of floats in and out of the children's lives. She is haunted by visions of her dead brother, Given, who only appears when she is high. Given was killed by a white acquaintance and cousin of Michael, the children's father, in high school. So you can imagine the drama surrounding that. Pop is acting as the children's primary caregiver when Michael is released from prison. Leonie then packs up her kids, grabs her best friend Misty, who happens to be white, and they set across the state for Parchman Farm, the Mississippi State Penitentiary. And you can see how far away that is in the map. Now, another major character in the novel is a boy named Richie. He's 12 years old and is imprisoned with Pop while he was in Parchman in the 1950s. So we kind of go back to the question of why are we reading Sing Unburied Sing at Eastern State? And how does a novel that's focused on Parchman Prison in Mississippi relate to Eastern State's own history here in Philadelphia? And the answer is quite simple. Literature and storytelling have always been a part of Eastern State's history, largely due to Charles Dickens, who you can see here. He was an English novelist in the 1800s, well known for several of the works on the screen, and he visited Eastern State Penitentiary in 1842. Dickens captured his observations of Eastern State in a work called American Notes for General Circulation. Themes such as social inequality, juvenile justice, and brutal prison conditions play out in many of Dickens' novels. So it's no surprise that Dickens wanted to visit a prison on his travels to America. Here, Dickens describes Eastern State's original architectural design and its separate system of solitary confinement. And we'll listen to this quote read by Dave.
In the outskirts stands a great prison called the Eastern Penitentiary, conducted on a plan peculiar to the state of Pennsylvania. The system here is rigid, strict, and hopeless solitary confinement, a large chamber from which several long passages radiate. On either side of each is a long, long row of cell doors with a certain number over every one. Above, a gallery of cells like those below. Standing at a central point and looking down these dreary passages, The dull repose and quiet prevails is awful.
Now to contrast this, in Sing Unburied Sing, Jesmyn Ward describes Parchman Farm, a real Mississippi prison notorious for its harsh system of prison labor and brutal conditions of communal living and working. And once again, Dave will read a quote for us.
Damn near 50,000 acres. Parchman is the kind of place that fool you into thinking it ain't no prison. Ain't going to be so bad when you first see it because ain't no walls. Back in the day, it was just 15 camps, each one surrounded by a barbed wire fence. Wasn't no brick, wasn't no stone. When I first got to Parchman, I worked in the fields, planting and weeding and harvesting crops. Parchman was a working farm right off. You see them open fields we worked in. The way you could look right through that barbed wire. The way they cut them tree flats so that the land is empty and open to the ends of the earth. And you think, I can get out of here if I set my mind to it.
Sing Unburied Sing not only sheds light on people who were imprisoned at Parchman Farm, but also the true lived experiences of people, specifically young people of color held in prisons and jails today. I'm going to be discussing the impact of incarceration on children in America, both historically through the true story of a young boy named Wilmer Jackson that you see here, and by utilizing the power of storytelling with the story of Richie from Sing Unburied Sing. Now, incarcerating children has long been a topic of controversy. When Charles Dickens visited, he took special notice of the children incarcerated at Eastern State.
Sitting upon the stairs, engaged in some slight work, was a pretty colored boy. Is there no refuge for young criminals in Philadelphia then, said I? Yes, but only the white children.
Dickens' observations reveals the relationship between race and punishment throughout Eastern State history, and specifically the ways it impacted young people. Records indicate a disproportionate number of African American children imprisoned at Eastern State Penitentiary. And like Dickens' observations of racism within the 19th and 20th century juvenile justice system, Ward uses her novel in the exact same way to highlight the disparate impact prisons have on young people of color, especially African Americans. Over the course of the novel, readers learn of the friendship between Pop and a young boy named Richie, developed during their time at Parchman Prison together in the 1950s. Many stories are revealed through flashbacks at Pop's time at Parchman and his protective relationship over Richie. Here we have Dave reading a quote of Pop describing Richie to his grandson, Jojo.
Richie, he was called. Real name was Richard, and he wasn't nothing but 12 years old. He was in for 3 years for stealing food, salted meat. Lots of folks were in there for stealing food because everyone was poor and starving. And even though white people couldn't get your work for free, they did everything they could to avoid hiring you and paying you for it.
The end of this quote begins to discuss the labor aspect of Sing Unburied Sing. If you're interested in continuing to explore how prison systems like Parchman impacted people of color and the relationship between the prison system and labor practices, look for our video next week from Tom about prison labor. Now I'm going to draw one last interesting connection between the novel and young people at Eastern State. As a tour guide, there are many personal stories that I have come to learn that resonate with me for a lot of reasons, but especially with how much they resemble present-day people in prison right now. They are complex, layered, and often difficult to share or interpret with our visitors. Wilmer Jackson's story is just one example of this, and I am honored to be able to share his story in full. I would also like to make the disclaimer that Wilmer's story might be difficult to hear and hard to process. In many ways, Richie's story in the novel is very similar to that of Wilmer Jackson, a young 13-year-old boy imprisoned at Eastern State Penitentiary in the 1930s, seen again here. Little is known about Wilmer's life. According to his death certificate, he was born in Sylvania, Georgia. But we know by 1930, his family had migrated north, where Wilmer lived with his parents, 6 siblings, and a cousin in Philadelphia near 11th and Girard, and what is now called the Yorktown neighborhood over near Temple University. In late June of 1934, police arrested Jackson and 2 other young people, Rudolph Smith and Ernest Brailsford, after allegedly trying to snatch the purses of 2 women in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. After their arrests, police accused the boys of a series of holdups, robberies, and beatings in Fairmount Park that spring. Police Lieutenant Frank Choblinski said that after questioning the boys, they made a statement admitting that they beat Walter Tiznick to death in the park during a robbery in early June. Police charged Wilmer Jackson and Rudolph Smith with Tiznick's murder at a hearing shortly after the boys' arrest. Jackson testified that detectives choked him to force him to confess to the murder. During their trial and sentencing, Jackson and Smith were characterized as juvenile desperados and incorrigible. The boys' trial and sentencing was swift. Wilmer Jackson was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison for second-degree murder, a murder without planning or premeditation. Wilmer Jackson and Rudolph Smith were admitted to Eastern State Penitentiary as prisoners C-9852 and C-9853, just 33 days after their arrest. In sentencing Jackson and Smith to Eastern State rather than a youth reformatory, Judge Raymond McNeil was quoted as saying he believed that they would be a constant menace to the other inmates at the reformatory if committed there even for a brief space. Wilmer Jackson and Rudolph Smith's stay at Eastern State, however, was brief. They were transferred to the Pennsylvania Industrial School, also known as Huntington, a youth reformatory in Central PA, on October 5th, 1934, shortly after Jackson's 14th birthday. Photographed here is what SCI Huntington looks like today. Still open and in operation, but for adults, not children. But back to Wilmer. It is unknown what prompted their transfer. Wilmer Jackson died at Huntington on January 28, 1941, of bronchial pneumonia. He was 20 years old. It is unknown what became of Rudolph Smith. Now, we believe that Wilmer Jackson is featured on the left of this photo. The identity of the person next to him is unknown. Wilmer's story, Richie's story, and all the other stories of children impacted by the prison system can be troubling and difficult to process. And the impacts of incarceration today extend to children outside of the prison walls. In America, 2.7 million children currently have a parent incarcerated. That is 1 out of 28 children or a kid in every single class. And just like JoJo, 45% of children who have a parent in jail or prison live with and rely on their grandparents for support. 1 in 4 children living with a grandparent lives in poverty, and an additional third does not have health insurance. So let's close with the thought that the character of Richie shares with JoJo towards the end of Sing Unburied Sing. Sometimes I think it done changed. Then I wake up and it ain't changed none. It's like a snake that sheds its skin. The outside looks different when the scales change, but inside, always the same. Ward also shows us that literature has the power to magnify the stories of the marginalized and can create space for conversation and reflection. Ward's novel also helps us recognize that all people, incarcerated or not, have a unique story to tell. Where else have you seen the power of storytelling shed light on an issue? Thank you so much for tuning in with me this week. Here's where you can find us on our social media. If you head over to Twitter, you'll find a thread that our historian Annie Anderson did earlier this afternoon, discussing other incarcerated children from Eastern State. Next week, we'll have Tom coming back to talk about prison labor. And if you have any questions for me, please leave them below in the comments and we'll be sure to respond. Thank you.